I found it behind a wall that hadn't been touched in centuries. Not a treasure chest, not a relic, not even something I was looking for. Just a small, folded letter wrapped in oilskin, sealed with dark wax, and attached to a faded note that made my hand shake the moment I read it. The note said, "Do not open until the right hands can finally understand what was sacrificed." Historical records we later pieced together suggested that letter had not been opened since the years of the Black Death, since a time when 1 in 3 people in Europe simply stopped existing. And when I finally broke that seal when I heard the wax crack after more than 600 years of silence, I found something I was completely unprepared for. Not a political secret. Not a hidden treasure map. Something far more powerful than either of those things. By the end of this story, you will understand why the greatest legacy history ever leaves behind is sometimes not wealth, not power, not the names carved into stone, but one forgotten voice that simply refused to disappear. To understand how one fragile letter survived 6 centuries, I have to take you back to the beginning, back to the version of me that existed before any of this happened. I was 51 years old when I found it. I had been living inside our convent for over 2 decades, and for most of those years, my primary responsibility was the archive. I was the one who cataloged the oldest records, who carefully unfolded manuscripts that crumbled at the edges if you breathed on them wrong, who spent entire afternoons reading documents in Latin, Old French, and occasionally languages I could only partially translate. I loved that work deeply. I believed and still believe that every page once belonged to a real person. Every damaged record represents someone who sat down, picked up a pen, and decided that something was worth remembering. My job was to honor that decision. Our convent was ancient, built in the 13th century, expanded in the 14th, partially damaged and rebuilt twice since then. The archive rooms were enormous and cold, even in summer. Dust settled on shelves in thick layers. Certain staircases led to rooms that hadn't been properly inventoried in generations. There were sealed vaults in the lower corridors that even the oldest sisters couldn't fully explain. The atmosphere down there was unlike anything I can properly describe: heavy, quiet, and somehow alive. Like the building itself was still holding its breath. The discovery happened during restoration work on the Eastern Archive wall. A stonemason had been hired to examine moisture damage along one section, and while he was carefully removing a section of deteriorated plaster, he stopped. Called me over. There, behind a thin layer of stone that had clearly been placed there deliberately, was a narrow compartment. Not deep. Maybe 8 inches wide and 12 inches tall. Inside it, wrapped in oilskin that had somehow survived centuries of cold and damp, was the letter. I didn't open it that day. I stood there for a long time just looking at it. The wax seal showed a small symbol I didn't immediately recognize: 2 interlocking rings surrounding what appeared to be a sprig of something. Rosemary, possibly. Or rue. Both plants had specific meanings in medieval medicine. That detail lodged itself in my mind and stayed there. The faded note attached to the outside was written in a hand that appeared much later than the letter itself, perhaps 2 centuries later, suggesting that someone else had discovered the compartment before me, read the note on the outside, and then chosen to seal it back inside the wall. That stopped me cold. Someone else had found this. Someone had made a deliberate choice not to open it. Why? I brought in a colleague, a historian named Dr. Reyes, who specialized in medieval manuscripts. She confirmed within the first examination that the oilskin wrapping and the style of the wax seal were consistent with the mid-14th century. The paper inside, visible only slightly at one edge, matched composition techniques used before 1370. The Black Death had swept through this region between 1347 and 1353. Whatever was inside that letter had been written during or immediately after one of the most catastrophic events in human history. And yet no archive we could find mentioned its existence. Not one record, not one inventory, not one passing reference in any of the convent's surviving documents. It was as though whoever placed it there had intentionally made sure nobody would know it existed. That mystery consumed me for 3 weeks before I finally opened it. I want to be honest about that decision because it wasn't simple. Part of me felt that opening it would be a violation. The note said the right hands. I kept asking myself, was I those hands? Did I have the right? I prayed about it. I sat with it. And then one evening, I carefully broke the seal. The letter was written in a late medieval French dialect, with occasional Latin phrases woven through it. It took me several days of careful translation, cross referencing with other documents from the same period, to work through the full text. And as I translated, something slowly became clear that I had not expected at all. The letter was written by a woman. She didn't give her full name, only initials M.A., and she identified herself as someone who had cared for the sick during the plague years in a village near our convent. Not a physician, not a noble, not a church official. An ordinary woman who had, by her own account, spent nearly 2 years moving between homes in the village, caring for the dying, organizing small groups of survivors to bring food to those who couldn't leave their houses, and doing something else that I had to read 3 times before I fully understood. She had been keeping records, careful, detailed, compassionate records, names of the sick, names of those who recovered, names of those who died and the family members they left behind. She had been trying to ensure that no one disappeared from memory without someone knowing they had existed. As I translated deeper into the letter, I found references to a hidden diary she had kept during those years. She described burying it for safekeeping when she realized she herself was becoming ill. She gave approximate directions, landmarks that no longer existed, but she described the diary as containing the names of over 400 people from the surrounding villages, people whose deaths had never been officially recorded because the normal systems of record keeping had completely collapsed during the worst years of the plague. 400 names, preserved by one woman, hidden somewhere, possibly still hidden because she had run out of time. And then I came to the section of the letter that completely undid me. She wrote, near the end, that she was not hiding the letter out of fear. She was hiding it out of love. She explained that she had witnessed people in her community being blamed falsely and viciously for spreading the plague, neighbors turning against neighbors, people she had cared for being driven from their homes based on nothing but fear and rumor. She had recorded the truth about several of these situations in her diary, and she was afraid that if the diary were found too soon, before people were ready to hear it, it would be destroyed. That the names inside it would be erased. That the truth about who those people were, ordinary, frightened, compassionate human beings, would never survive. So she sealed the letter instead, left it for hands she could not see, trusted that someone, someday, would find it in a time when the record could finally be honored rather than destroyed. I sat with that for a long time. I wept, honestly, not dramatically, just quietly, alone in the archive, with the translated pages in front of me and the centuries pressing down on my shoulders. The search for the diary took another 4 months. Dr. Reyes brought in 2 other historians. We used the architectural clues in the letter, cross-referenced them with old land surveys and a damaged set of maps we found in a sealed inventory box in the lower vault. A box that had been sitting unopened for over 150 years. One of those maps showed a building that no longer stood in a location that is now a small field about half a mile from our convent walls. We found the diary in an earthenware jar buried beneath the foundation remains of that building. It was damaged. Parts of it were completely lost, but a significant portion of it survived. And inside it were names, hundreds of them written in the same careful hand as the letter. Each name accompanied by a small note: good man, kind neighbor, beloved mother, brave child. She had written something small and human next to every single name, because she wanted whoever found it to understand that these were not just casualties, they were people. The local community response when we announced the discovery was something I was not prepared for. People came to the convent asking questions. Historians from several universities requested access. A small exhibition was organized. One elderly woman arrived one afternoon claiming that a family name in the diary matched a name that had been passed down through her family for generations, a name they had kept alive but never fully understood why. She stood in front of the display case holding a photograph of her grandmother, and she didn't say anything for a very long time. I think about that woman often. I think about what it means to be remembered, to have someone decide in the middle of their own suffering that your name deserves to survive. M.A. never became famous. We were never able to identify her fully. Her diary does not appear in any official historical record because she was never considered important enough to document. She was not a queen, not a saint, not a general. She was a woman who walked between dying people with food and water and a pen, and who believed that love required witness. And she was right. Because here I am, 600 years later, telling you her story. I used to think that history was stored in the documents of the powerful, in royal decrees and papal letters and military records, and maybe most of it is. But the history that changed me, the history that lives inside me now, was stored in a wall, written by someone whose hands shook, addressed to no one and everyone, sealed with wax and trust and the quiet, extraordinary faith that goodness could outlast darkness. I think about the note on the outside of that letter every single day. Do not open until the right hands can finally understand what was sacrificed. I don't know if my hands were the right ones. I genuinely don't. But I know I tried to honor what I found, and I know that every name in that diary now exists in an archive, documented, preserved, remembered. History will never remember everything. It can't. But sometimes, hidden inside a wall, inside a forgotten field, inside a fragile piece of paper that somehow survived everything, there is a voice that refused to go quietly. A voice that said, "These people mattered. This kindness happened. This love was real, and all it needed was someone willing to finally listen." Now I want to hear from you. If you had been the one who found that letter, would you have opened it immediately, or would you have first tried to understand why it had been sealed for so long? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if the story of M.A., of one woman's quiet, extraordinary courage, moved you in a way you didn't expect, please share this video, because she spent her life making sure people weren't forgotten. The least we can do is make sure she isn't either.